speaker is going to be John Wharton Lowe. And I thought the best way to introduce him was to think about what often happens here between the participants when we're sitting on the Bell Hall porch, and we're just kind of being as casual as we can. One question that always comes up is, how did you choose the seminar leaders and lecturers? So, believe it or not, I have a stock response. It is, first, we start by thinking about top-of-the-line scholars who have a strong but general O'Connor connection. Then we look at individuals who tend to have some well-defined theory or angle of approach to O'Connor that meshes with her interest in the critical history. And then third, we pray that we will find a giant in one or two of the broader fields of American studies. Southern literature, African American literature, just the broader field. Individuals that, whatever their O'Connor history, have a vision that helps us to see her in a fresh new way. Last night, we heard from one of the giants that we managed to reel in. And tonight, in good Southern language, we are blessed to hear from a second one. And that, of course, is Professor Lowe. Since 2012, Professor Lowe, with degrees from Vanderbilt, Georgia State, and Columbia Universities, has been the Barbara Lester Melvin Distinguished Professor at the University of Georgia, a position he arrived at after many years as a professor of English and comparative literature at Louisiana State University. He's held posts as the founding director for the program in Louisiana and Caribbean Studies. He's been a senior Fulbright professor at America Institute University of Munich, a Mellon faculty fellow at Harvard, and an assistant professor of English and co-director of American Studies at St. Mary's College of Notre Dame. His publications, as many of you know, are voluminous, headlined by his groundbreaking, and I always actually believe discipline-birthing, 2016 book, Calypso Magnolia, The Cross-Currents of Caribbean and Southern Literature, a work which won both the C. Hugh Holman Award from the Society for the Study of Southern Literature and the Sharon Dean Award from the Constance Fenimore Wilson Society. His other books include major works on Zora Neale Hurston, Jump at the Sun, Zora Neale Hurston's Cosmic Comedy, and he has produced a lot of materials aimed to make us all better teachers, including editing 2 volumes of the MLA Approaches to Teaching series, 2009's Approaches to Teaching Their Eyes Were Watching God, and more recently, Approaches to Teaching Gaines's The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman and Other Works. Other edited collections he has shaped are Summoning Our Saints, The Poetry and Prose of Brenda Marie Osby, Louisiana Culture from the Colonial Era to Katrina, Bridging Southern Cultures, and Conversations with Ernest Gaines in 1995. When you turn to his published articles, his range and his grasp of knowledge is astounding. He can write about a variety of subjects that span from Faulkner and Richard Wright to Eudora Welty to Frank Yearby. And if you don't know who Frank Yearby is, you have an assignment for tonight. As well as Steel Magnolias. That's the one I'm waiting to read. This is impressive. But 2 additional things about Professor Lowe stand out. First, though he officially retired this year from full-time teaching, he still has on his CV works in progress, works that include a major biography of Ernest Gaines. Second, Professor Lowe has created an impressive legacy of mentoring and teaching young scholars to ensure the continuing life of our discipline and to add in subtle ways to our broader culture. One former graduate student, learning that we were going to have Professor Lowe here, emailed me this: John is not only a distinguished scholar, he is an impeccable chef. Those who've had the privilege of sitting at his dining room table at Chez Lowe know that his cooking, especially his chicken cordon bleu and jambalaya, are matched only by his sense of sartorial style, culture. But above all, John is a generous guide and the kindest friend. Tonight, he is the last of our 6 lectures for this NEH Summer Institute. His topic is Flannery O'Connor's use of humor. Would you please welcome Professor John Lowe.
Good evening. Thanks so much for that kind introduction. It's indeed an honor to be here with such fine scholars and to partner with my dear friend of many years, indeed decades, Professor Thaddeus Davis. I want to thank Professors Bob Donahue and Bruce Gentry in particular for smoothing our way and for doing the heavy lifting that was required to conceptualize, facilitate, and direct such a daunting but richly rewarding enterprise, and also for the splendid scholarship on O'Connor they have given us over the years. My subject is humor, so let me start out with a joke that I think that O'Connor might have liked. There was this New York yuppie who had a dream of shooting a wild duck, and he read that Louisiana was the sportsman's paradise, so he went to Abercrombie and Fitch, got a good rifle, and flew to Lafayette. That's Cajun country. He went out into the fields, and he saw a duck, a big duck, flying over him, and he said, "Bless me, Jesus, help me." He fired, and a miracle happened. He actually hit it. And the duck fell into a field, but there was a fence around the field. And he looked around. He didn't see anybody, so he jumped over the fence, was picking up the duck, and he heard a voice, and it said, "My land, my duck." And he looked around. There's this little Cajun farmer, and he said, "I've been dreaming about this duck for years. Can't you let me have it? I'll pay you for it." He said, "Well, Sheriff, down here we don't do stuff like that. We have a man's contest, and see, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take turns kicking each other between the legs, and whoever is the biggest, best man can take it, he gets the duck." So anyway, the Yankee said, "This is a little old man, he can't do much harm, I can take it." So the Cajun says, "It's my land, Sheriff, so I go first." So he hauled off and he kicked him between the legs, and the Yankee fell. He was in agony. He thought he'd never get over it. But he stood up finally and he said, "Okay, now it's my turn." And the Cajun said, "Hell, Sheriff, it's just a duck. Take it." Now, what does this joke have to do with Flannery O'Connor? It's not religious except for the plea to God. It's not set in Georgia, but it is set in the South, specifically the rural South. It's all about borders and transgressing borders. One of the things Professor Donahue has emphasized about O'Connor is that she's all about borders, delineating them, praising them, or conversely transgressing them. Her characters seem to always be poised on a moral cliff, an extreme form of a boundary. And yet their narratives almost always contain some comedic element, be it slapstick, cracker, African-American, absurdist, gallows, sick, dark, or so often grotesque humor. Let's think again about the setup of the joke. We have an educated but ironically naive outsider, a Yankee, coming down south to reap a resource, the duck, in the mode of northern colonizers. His well-chosen garb is outlandish to the yokels. The Cajun, by contrast, speaks in comic dialect, is rural and deemed ignorant by the intruder, who has to illegally cross the Cajun's fence. No, it's not really a miracle the bullet finds its prey, but it is sort of one. And the joke, which is also a story, ends twice. First, in violence, and second, in revelation, both for us and the Yankee, in that the old Cajun is seen to be smarter than the hunter. But above all, the violence is inescapably linked to laughter, ours and presumably the Cajun, who will no doubt regale his family and friends with the tale of how he outsmarted the intruder. Jokes depend on an economy of expression, too. Brevity is the soul of wit. O'Connor learned this initially through her cartoons, which had not only to operate within a tight frame, but to make the comic point quickly and effectively. Her prior life as an artist before Iowa focused on these cartoons that she created for both her high school and college literary organs, and I'm really grateful to Thaddeus for telling us so much about them last night. Most of these concerns that are in there give us the gripes and rites of passage for students that are eternal. but the details of the simple figures are revealing of the age in terms of hairstyles, clothing, especially patterned skirts, headscarves, saddle oxfords. Almost all the figures have long beak-like noses. There are topical items too, such as paying a poll tax, which was of course designed to keep African American voters away, doing exercises in order to look like the Waves who were fellow students, and so on. Several put in digs at hypocrisy, and in one that depicts two co-eds in a picture gallery with one smirking, "I don't enjoy looking at these old pictures either, but it don't hurt my reputation for people to think I'm a lover of fine arts." Another bias comes when a stick figure muses that if worst comes to worst, she can always get a PhD, something that always elicited O'Connor's scorn. The acerbic wit of many of these portraits were accompanied, however, by more traditional visions of campus life, which shows that O'Connor could put both salt and sugar on her artistic table. My first job was at a Catholic women's college, so I can appreciate how O'Connor thrived in such an environment which permitted her to both star and lead. There's a telling picture of her and her colleagues at the literary magazine she edited in the Gooch biography. She's in the center and she's beaming. It must have been a shock when she arrived at the University of Iowa, where she, along with the characters she created, were viewed as exotics, alien, and other. Indeed, initially, her teachers professed to be unable to understand her thick Georgia drawl and wouldn't let her read her own stories out loud. However, once the stories were read and discussed, her intelligence, creativity, and sense of craft broke through the cultural barriers, and she became the star student. One of the attractions of the stories for her teachers and peers was the irreverent eruption of down-home humor in her work, which was complicated by a more sophisticated use of irony and inventive invective in the controlling narrative voices. After her acceptance, she was able to code switch in conversations, letters, and lectures, slipping back and forth into dialect or idiom. In other words, performing the Southern schnick. But to her advantage, her experiences at Iowa in this regard were similar to those of Zora Neale Hurston, a native of backwoods Florida with a map of Dixie on her tongue, who used mother wit to illustrate her yarns and then her printed stories when she became the only black student at fancy Barnard College in New York. She soon became a favorite at both Harlem rent parties and downtown do's hosted by whites such as Fannie Hurst and Carl Van Vechten. I can relate to this. When I moved to Manhattan for graduate school at Columbia, I lived 2 blocks away from where O'Connor did when she lived in New York, and my Southern accent drew attention. Once at a cocktail party, somebody asked me, "You's got an accent. Where are you from?" I told him I was from Atlanta. Then I said, "You got an accent too. Where are you from?" Which drew the indignant reply, "I don't have an accent. I'm from Jersey." Another curious New Yorker asked me if it was true that many Southerners didn't wear shoes. I had to work overtime to show my peers I didn't just crawl out of a haystack. But 2 things happened. Jimmy Carter ran for president. I was from Georgia, so I became an expert. Then I took a Faulkner seminar, and I really got some RESPECT. Like O'Connor and Hurston, I learned to code switch, talking lit crit at one moment and down home at another. There were other social obstacles, too. O'Connor was well aware of the bias in the South against Catholics, particularly in her own middle Georgia, which she inserts into her religiously bigoted characters like Mrs. Shortley. There was a great deal of resistance to the candidacy of John F. Kennedy in the South. I remember someone telling a joke before the election. Kennedy lost, and the first thing he did was send a telegram to the Pope. It was one word. What did he say? Unpack. At the same time, while embedding the principles of her faith in her story, she was ready to pounce on the negative things she saw about the local church. While we're all familiar with her acerbic takedowns of fundamentalist pieties and sentimentalities, she didn't draw back from making virtually identical critiques of lackadaisical Catholics, including priests and nuns. In a letter to John Lynch, she warns him, "Of course, this vapid Catholicism can influence you. You want to be shut of it. The Catholic influence has to come at a deeper level. I was brought up in that novena rosary tradition too, but you have to save yourself from it some way or dry up. O'Connor had a canny understanding that she could turn the tables on the normal speakers by jazzing up her stories with aberrant spelling, dialect, and vernacular sayings. This practice often involves showing readers that uneducated people could be crafty, cunning, or even better, wise and gifted at dealing with the life they've been dealt. But she could also cut to the quick in intellectual discussion by employing comic down-home references, as in her statement, "Every time I hear about the school of Southern degeneracy, I feel like Brer Rabbit stuck on the tar baby." From the outset, however, she was wary of going too far with the Southern Act, either in her writing or in her dealings with Northern intellectuals. She often warned against the trap of catering to the expectations other areas had for the regional Southern writer. The specter of becoming like Erskine Caldwell was a real danger. We should remember his novel Tobacco Road, when transformed into a play, for many years held the performance record on Broadway, largely because of its raucous humor, which came from the stereotypical presentation of rednecks that catered to Northern expectations of an intoxicating mix of sexuality, incongruity, violence, and comic stupidity, all seemingly innate in his characters. There's more to Caldwell than this, I would suggest, particularly in his short stories, his nonfiction, and in the textile mill sections of God's Little Acre, but there's no question that he represented for O'Connor, especially since he, like her, was from Georgia and set his tales there, the substitution of comic sensation for art. We know she had read him as her self-reflexive alter ego in the early comic story The Crop decides that she has to write about social problems, and she settles on sharecroppers, about which she knows little. But she has read, we infer, Tobacco Road, which she mimics in her draft to hilarious effect. Humor became a way of enlivening her prose. As she stated in The Fiction Writer and His Country, quote, "The writer can choose what he writes about, but he cannot choose what he is able to make live. And so far as he's concerned, a living deformed character is acceptable, and a dead whole one is not." Moreover, deformed characters were preferred in order to understand their defects and sometimes to try to heal them. In parallel fashion, very often she creates unattractive characters who then express profound truths, especially, of course, in moments of revelation. But their faults are usually offset by their eccentricities, which create a paradoxical attraction for the reader. This is a rather ancient technique. The teacher of Bacchus, old Silenus, was homely and hair-covered, but he had a beautiful soul. Crude and simple without, but complex and finely wrought within. Ancient Greeks understood him as a trope for mystical inversion, and of course mystery is a central concern for O'Connor. She had a handy model for this in her beloved Uncle Remus, whose comic dialect and aged appearance masked a deep wisdom born out of slavery. O'Connor shared with Hurston an admiration for Southern vernacular idiom and everyday speech, which was so infused with the quotidian and the natural world. She also reveled in the common folk's ability to signify on the high and the mighty through a devastating, leveling humor. We see that all the time in all of her stories. She also saw that that people at all levels employed humor to keep sane when facing trying human conditions. Bakhtin called this the speech of the public square, thinking of peasant culture in Russian towns. As he remarked, "The least contemptible class of people seem to me to be those who, through their simplicity, occupy the lowest rank, and they seem to show greater regularity in their relations. The morals and talk of peasants I find commonly more obedient to the prescriptions of true philosophy than are those of our philosophers. The common people are wiser because they are as wise as they need be." As many early critics of O'Connor demonstrated in great detail, what she most cared about was exposing the moral corruption of the rotten, the word she likes, world around her. In this regard, she fit the formula her literary heir Walker Percy cooked up in his essay, The Diagnostic Novel on the Uses of Modern Fiction. Trained as a doctor and a devout Catholic convert, he saw utility in a literary diagnostic method which the novelist can use to restore the patient, which is culture itself. He sums this up. He seeks some remnant of a common ground from which he can see and tell, and where he hopes there will be other writers, other readers, who share, if not a consensus, at least a common sense of predicament. O'Connor would surely have agreed with this assessment, with the notion, too, of exploratory surgery as part of the diagnosis. Her scalpel very often was sharp-edged humor. I want to shift now and suggest we could gain some new apertures into her humor by thinking of it as an ethnic set of writings. Indeed, the very first book I reviewed, the Harvard Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups, has an entry on Southerners by John Shelton Reed, the Dean of Southern Sociologists. He notes that Southerners have differed from the national norm: poorer, less well-educated, more rural, politically conservative, and until recently identifiable by their accent. But above all, they're viewed as different from the rest of the nation. There's a boundary, there's that word again, around them, and as Frederick Barth has suggested, boundaries are more than content define ethnic groups, and these borders can shift over time. And they have shifted. While the South has, since Reed wrote his essay, become much more urban, affluent, and educated, is still different in many ways from the nation, and perhaps has returned to constituting a separate political realm, so much so that people in blue states are calling for the South to secede again. According to most pundits, race has a lot to do with it, in that so-called Christian nationalism has a firm locus in the South. However, this has to be modified by the realization that the South's black citizens, by and large, practice a similarly fundamentalist Protestant religion, yet have quite a different view on race. Recently, Jennifer Greason, in her study Our South, has shown how Northern writers, by focusing on the South's differences, used it as a deviant and recalcitrant other, a region that defined what the nation did not want to be. Her focus on 19th century American literature has been complemented by Leanne Duck's book, The Nation's Region, which takes this argument into the 20th century. The South, she argues, after the Great Depression and the rise of fascism, emerges as the trope of the backward South, which began to comprise an image of what the United States could become. I remember when there was a modern-day lynching of a black man in New York City, which led the then mayor, Ed Koch, to cry out, "This isn't the kind of thing that happens in New York, it happens in Mississippi." Of course, Malcolm X famously declared that everything south of the Canadian border was Mississippi. The word ethnicity has been exhaustively researched. R.A. Schermerhorn describes an ethnic group as, quote, a collectivity within a larger society having real or putative common ancestry, memories of a shared historical past, and a cultural focus on one or more symbolic elements, which defines the epitome of their peoplehood. And some of the examples he lists in the symbolic elements are kinship patterns, physical contiguity, or as in localism or sectionalism, religious affiliation, language or dialect forms, phenotypal features, or any combination of these. And I think you can see that O'Connor uses almost all of these. While the South is often misunderstood as a white nationalist outlier of the rest of the population, we need to remember it's always had a large black population and also has been a gateway for immigrants, with the ports of Charleston, New Orleans, and many others where immigrants have been welcomed. O'Connor's own relatives came from Ireland, and for a time, even in the Northeast, the Irish were not seen as white. And there were ugly cartoons in major newspapers and journals depicting apparent crocodiles emerging on New York shores from the sea. But upon inspection, they're Catholic bishops with their mitres standing in for the animals' snouts. A deluge of novels were published during the flood time of immigration, exposing supposed debauchery in convents, and one nunnery was burned in Boston. Max Eastman, one of the founders of the Masses and the Liberator, pointed out how humor can grow out of disappointment. As an Irish wag once said, "When the Irish come to America, they thought the streets would be paved with gold. Once they got there, they found the streets weren't gold. They weren't paved. They were expected to pave them." O'Connor claimed not to be that interested in her Irish background, but in her early short story, The Crop, the misguided writer, Miss Willerton, at first decides, as I've mentioned, to write on sharecroppers because they're exotic, even though she doesn't know much about them. But ultimately, she seizes on the Irish, another exotic group that she romanticizes. Aspects of O'Connor's humor may be found in her employment of basic ethnic scripts, which can be positive or negative. Christy Davies has identified two main streams. The first one depicts groups as crafty and stingy, and here we have the Scots, the Sikhs from India, New Englanders. The second group is featured as lascivious, lazy, and dumb. And that would include the Irish, African Americans, Italians, and of course, poor white Southerners. O'Connor uses virtually all of these. Her chief examples are black workers and the supposedly shiftless white trash, that's her term of course, farm workers who are apparently modeled on some hired by her mother Regina for the dairy farm. Here, O'Connor echoes the 18th century surveyor and writer William Byrd, who wrote of the slothfulness of the North Carolina peasants he met. Quote, "The men, for their parts, just like the Indians, impose all the work upon the poor women. They lie and snore till the sun has run 1/3 of his course. Then after stretching, yawning for half an hour, they light their pipes and venture out. If it's never so little cold, they quickly return shivering. When the weather is mild, they stand leaning upon the cornfield fence and gravely consider whether they had best go and take a small heat at the hoe, but generally find reasons to put it off till another time. To speak the truth, 'tis a thorough aversion to labor that makes the people file off to North Carolina, where plenty and a warm sun confirm them in their disposition to laziness for their whole lives." This sounds a lot like my grandmother's fable. And she would tell us, lazy old Snuffy's family was hungry, so a kind neighbor bought a load of corn up to their porch where Snuffy lay with a jug of shine. When offered the corn, he raised up and said, "Is it shucked?" Informed it wasn't, he flopped down and told the neighbor, "Drive on the cart." When my grandmother offered to take us to town to buy us some Easter clothes and we weren't interested, she would just say, "That's right, drive on the cart." We knew what she meant. To her credit, O'Connor delights in exploding readers' expectations by dismantling stereotypes of various kinds of Southerners, but she fails for the most part in this regard with her African American characters. While O'Connor was more sympathetic to the plight of Georgia's black population than some, she indulges in some of these kinds of depictions, usually in a comic way. In her letters, her portrayal of family retainers such as Schott are quite stereotypical. Indeed, she doesn't usually mention the help unless they've demonstrated aberrant, usually violent behavior coupled with comic expression. While there are many examples, only two will suffice. Writing Thomas Stritch, she relates, "Schott was at the back door early this morning to say he had a cousin who died last Friday and he must be off for the funeral today. He'll spend it riding up and down the road with a bad crowd loose along the way. We also heard they're going to barbecue a goat. Regina let him go after giving a Jonathan Edwards type sermon letting him know she didn't accept the story. He does love bad company." In a letter to A, she relates, "We've had a bad week around here. Liquor's been coming in. Wednesday, Louise threw scalding water on Schott. He had to be taken by Regina to the emergency room at the hospital. He's more or less out all week from it. Louise was very pleased that she scalded him. Later in the day, I asked Regina if she was still pleased with herself. Regina said, no, she was sorry now that she hadn't killed him." Passages like this in the fiction in the letters all too often turn black people or characters into minstrel figures. Still, part of the ethnic script here is doubled. While blacks are said to be stupid, on other occasions they're declared to be cunning and crafty. Well, which one is it? Especially in finding ways to avoid work, do some petty stealing, and get revenge on one another. It's interesting, too, that many of the comic racial portraits she created were for the benefit of her northern friends, like the Fitzgeralds. These depictions, which find myriad examples in her always amusing letters, show O'Connor practicing, yes, a kind of minstrelsy, but went along with the lines depicted in Eric Lott's study, Love and Theft, where condescending and scoffing humor is somewhat balanced by obvious affection that employers have for their black servants. Yet we have moving and moral black characters in her fiction too, as in her very first story, The Geranium, and in her second novel, The Violent Bear It Away, where Black Buford has the decency and compassion to complete the burial of old Tarwater that his great-nephew abandons. The debate over O'Connor and race was recently raised powerfully in Alamo O'Donnell's Radical Ambivalence, Race and Flannery O'Connor, but would have profited from a more informed reading of the comic attentions in the fiction letters and essays. Ethnic humor has always provided an important part of the world of U.S. folklore and culture, and there's been a lot of it in Southern literature, but not identified as such, partly because it provides pleasure, and partly because of its connection with mythical concepts of aggression, struggle, and eternal struggles between dominant and still emerging cultures. More importantly, humor, I argue, is absolutely central to our conception of the world. Writers who employ humor are always suspect, though, particularly by pointy-headed intellectuals, like literary critics like me, who see a lack of seriousness as a sign of ignorance. O'Connor, like many of her predecessors in Southern literature, but also her contemporaries such as Faulkner and Welty, always understood that humor creates intimacy, particularly that between the author and her reader, but also between characters. But make no mistake, she also knew keenly that humor is a double-edged sword. It can also be aggressive, hurtful, racist, and sexist. Her situation thus in many ways mirrored that of immigrants whose imperfect English measured against the standard WASP version makes them a kind of societal clown who distorts the idea of the normal. And indeed, we might expand this distortion of the normal to express the ways in which the U.S. South and Southerners were viewed for literary centuries, and sometimes today too, although distinct Southern accents such as O'Connor's have rapidly been evaporating. Of course, she saw her society itself as distorted, having fallen away from religion into modes of what she saw as existential, hedonistic, and all too often atheistic forms. What, after all, is the grotesque, if not a distortion? If Walker Percy's right that the writer can function as a physician diagnostician for the human condition, the displaced person is perhaps the O'Connor story we most need today, when hysteria over the border in particular and immigration in general are rampant. If we substituted Mexicans or Hondurans for the Poles in the story, it would still fit our needs. The tale opens with hyperbole as the wife of the tenant worker of the farm, Mrs. Shortley, despite her name, is climbing the hill with a peacock following her, a symbol of pride. O'Connor tells us she might have been the giant wife of the countryside, come out at some sign of danger to see what the trouble was. I think that refers to the wife of the giant in the fairy tale Jack and the Beanstalk, where the title character is indeed in the giant lady's territory to steal. And this is the conviction of Mrs. Shortley, the tenant's wife, and also of the black workers Astor and Sulk. When Mr. Guisac, initially introduced to the reader not by that name, but as the displaced person with capital letters, kisses Mrs. McIntyre's hand, the owner of the farm, instinctively watching this, Mrs. Shortley wipes her hand against her rear and thinks, if Mr. Shortley tried to kiss her hand, she would have knocked him into the middle of next week. But then Mr. Shortley wouldn't have kissed her hand anyway. He didn't have time to mess around. This comic reflection begins O'Connor's journey through the thoughts of these two women, here in a rejection of foreign manners, one that is symbolic of nativist and often racist ways of thinking. Having no time to mess around speaks to the all-consuming adherence to a capitalist clock. Mrs. Shortley, upon hearing the Polish daughter is named Sledgewig, is reminded of something you'd name a bug, or vice versa if you named a boy Boll Weevil. She decides the last name of Guisac amounts to Gobblehook, and she and Mrs. McIntyre employ this label often. Explaining the term displaced person to the black workers, Mrs. Shortley tells them, it means they ain't where they were born at. There's nowhere for them to go, like if you was run out of here and wouldn't nobody have you. To which old Astor rightly replies, and wisely, if they here, they somewhere. Irritated at what she thinks of as the illogic of Negro thinking, she gets to the point. The displaced people might well take the place of current workers on the farm. She doesn't mince words. I heard her say, this is going to put the fear of the Lord into those shiftless inward. But O'Connor doesn't leave it there. She takes us into Mrs. Shortley's head, as she ignores the myriad suns in the peacock's spread tail that O'Connor often equates with the sacred. Instead, she sees the repetitive figures on the tail representing, quote, the 10 million billion of them pushing their way into new places over here, and herself a giant angel with wings as wide as a house, telling the Negroes they would have to find another place. This is, of course, a comic vision translated to the rural South of the biblical expulsion from Eden, so similar to those today who mount the conspiracy theory of racial displacement. Mahadev Apte has shown that ethnic humor, which is basic in almost all society, stems from ethnocentrism, in-group adulation, out-group resentment, prejudice, and intolerance of the lifestyles of others, unquote. Most of this kind of humor is racist, but it's usually created to combat undesired socio-cultural traits such as excessive sexuality, uncleanliness, and gluttony, and many times these qualities are projected onto ethnics so as to make them the comic butt. Overgeneralization is rampant, and a lot of her characters use hyperbole over and over, and variation within the group is ignored. These practices, of course, lead to stereotypes. Walter Lippmann defines stereotypes as mental pictures formulated by people to describe the world beyond their reach. They're culturally determined, but factually incorrect, and they tend to persist even when scientifically proven wrong. And you see all these people ignoring science and facts today, alternate facts as they're called now. A key subject that needs to be addressed in O'Connor, too, is folklore, and we know that at its heart you find the engine of humor, a word that's been defined any number of ways, but sometimes most fruitfully by folklorists who have looked at jokes, comic sayings, graffiti, riddles, and verbal games as creative inventions, often of rural people who use the farming world, animals, and nature for raw materials. And I had a long thing on animals. I'm going to spare you, but it'll be in a printed version of this, I hope. Many ethnic writers, such as Jerry Mangione, an Italian-American, Abraham Cahan, Jewish-American, and Hurston, have utilized folklore in a double way, creating laughter, but also suggesting the underlying wisdom and creativity of their cultures. There are many elements of popular folkloric myths in O'Connor, too, that get skewered. The grandmother in A Good Man pins cloth violets to her outfit, quote, in case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. And of course, this is a variation that many Southern mothers give to their daughters. Remember, you should always have good underwear on in case of a wreck. Of course, the grandmother's precaution turns out to be correct, as she will indeed be found lying dead. The misfit responds to the grandmother's offer to give him her money. There never was a body that give the undertaker a tip. O'Connor employs humor and ambidextrosy, as I think all this is demonstrated. I mean, she attacked every level on the social pyramid in the South. Throughout her life, she made savage fun of the old South partisans of the lost cause. And she had nothing but contempt for romances like Gone with the Wind. And although she often spoke to local genteel ladies groups who endured that book, she made mock of them behind their back. At the same time, she loved her farm and in many ways saw virtues in the South. And she was a kind of an agrarian, like the ones at Vanderbilt. Despite the warts that she so devastatingly revealed, she did have affection for the region and made savage attacks on smarty-pants Yankees who turned up their noses. Her most famous put-down of Northerners that you're all familiar with, anything that comes out of the South is going to be called grotesque by the Northern reader, unless it is grotesque, in which case it's going to be called realistic. Like many Southern writers and intellectuals, O'Connor had nothing but scorn for Mitchell, as I suggested, or the film it inspired, GWTW as we call it in the South. Her hilarious story, A Late Encounter with the Enemy, shreds any number of pious Southern myths about the wall, and as Mark Twain called it at the time, before the wall. The general, actually a major in the Civil War, maybe just a foot soldier, got his outfit when he was summoned to the premiere. We also see him displayed each Confederate Memorial Day at the Capital City Museum, almost like a mummy, and at annual pilgrimages. The story culminates when his 60-ish niece finally graduates from college and wheels him to the ceremony. O'Connor tells us I think it's his daughter, I don't know why I put niece in there. The graduates in their heavy robes looked as if the last beads of ignorance were being sweated out of them. All of us who've been to graduation can relate to this. Suddenly, the old man who's forgotten most of his life's events and family members has a flash of memory, which kills him, and his body is wheeled out into the long line at the Coca-Cola machine, a sign of the intrusion of the modern into the Old South. A forced juxtaposition. As Freud tells us, a joke is the forced union of two opposed elements. That's the case here. The highlight of his life wasn't the war, which he doesn't really remember, but as he puts it, I was in that preemie they had in Atlanta, surrounded by beautiful girls. It wasn't a thing local about it. Nothing local about it. Listen here. Every person in it had paid $10 to get in and wear this tuxedo. I was in this uniform. The 1996 Olympics, which I attended, was compared as an event by many in the city to the similar crowning moment in 1939 when Atlanta was on the nation's screen. Scarlett O'Hara, brash and beautiful, was always understood as a counterpart to her adopted city. The child of Catholic immigrants made rich by their fabulous plantation, she restored the family's fortunes after the war by a series of shrewd marriages and her pioneering work as an urban businesswoman. Atlanta, which became the city too busy to hate during the 1960s, like Scarlett, got over the war quickly, taking advantage of the new transportation and trade potentials. The cyclorama, Atlanta's Shrine to the Battle of Atlanta, and the world's largest painting, includes photos and exhibits and brochures of the visits paid to the painting during premiere week by the stars of GWTW, Clark Gable, Vivian Leigh, Olivia de Havilland, and Leslie Howard. Of course, Hattie McDaniels couldn't come because she was black, but she got the last laugh because she won the Academy Award. I found out that the cyclorama was painted actually as a tribute to a Northern victory, and it was painted in Milwaukee by German and Austrian artists, but it found its way to Atlanta circuitously. In many ways, obviously, it pays tribute to the Yankee soldiers, and over the years has attracted millions of tourists from all over the world to its monumental portrayal of what is often understood as the central battle of the war, despite what others say about First and Second Manassas, Vicksburg, Shiloh, or Gettysburg. And I'll just say parenthetically, my great-great-grandfather and his brother are prominently featured in the cyclorama, but that's another story. And my father was a cadet commander at Tech High School in Atlanta, and he was at the premiere with his troops with sabers drawn. And it was at Lowe's Grand Theater. It's not spelled like my name, but still. There's several comic aspects to this. My Martin ancestors in the painting, one of them is supposed to be a Yankee soldier who finds a dying Confederate, gives him water, and finds out it's his brother. And my mother told me that because she knew the soldier that her great-grandfather who survived, that they were both Confederates, but one of them did enlist in Tennessee. My great-grandfather lived to be almost 100, and like General Sash in the story, was called upon to attend many memorial services. Our family told the people of the cyclorama about their error, but they've never changed the story. Like O'Connor's signification on the change of Mr. Sash's rank, the tale, which is still being told, is a better story than the real one. And that was always something that O'Connor would use in her tales. Her characters of all sorts prefer the myth over the truth. Always a possibility for comedy. As her well-meaning friends and relatives repeatedly told her, in the story, and also in the story, The Enduring Chill, Mrs. Fox suggests to her ailing son, Asbury, I think it would be nice if you wrote a book about down here. We need another good book like Gone with the Wind. Put the war in it. That always makes a long book. O'Connor was living in Atlanta when the world premiere took place on December 15th, 1939. It was said to be the most important event in Atlanta's history since Sherman burned it. O'Connor would have been an impressionable 14 years old then, but she was always irritated by the falseness of the novel and the film and the hoopla of the premiere, and she got her revenge in this story. I want to emphasize her self-reflexive humor, too. Her disdain for genteel Southern social events has an underside in her delight in more vulgar social events, such as the crowning at beauty pageants of Miss Georgia Chick or Miss Watermelon. Her comic use of popular culture, however, is not confined to the South. In an example of her self-mocking humor, which Freud identified as a key aspect of Jewish humor, she referred to her appearance on television. I already feel like a combination of Monsignor Sheen and Gorgeous George, who's a popular wrestler of the time. Everybody's read Wise Blood thinks I'm a hillbilly nihilist, whereas I would like to create the impression over the television that I'm a hillbilly Thomist, but I will probably not be able to think of anything but, huh, and I don't know. I keep having a mental picture of my glacial glare being sent out over the nation onto millions of children who are waiting impatiently for Batman to come on. She often belittles her appearance, particularly in photographs. She once wrote, I had to go have my picture taken for the purposes of Harcourt Brace. They were all bad. The one I sent looks like I had just bitten my grandmother and that this was one of my few pleasures. After being asked to appear on TV, she wrote, I'm going to be real glad when this television thing is over with. A touching aspect of this self-reflexive humor was her tendency to mock the disease that killed her, lupus. She wrote Marriott Lee, you didn't know that I had a dread disease, did you? Well, I got one. My father died of the same stuff at the age of 44, but the scientists hope to keep me here till I'm 96. I owe my existence and cheerful countenance to the pituitary glands of thousands of pigs butchered daily in Chicago, Illinois at the Armour packing plant. If pigs wore garments, I wouldn't be worthy to kiss the hymns. There are myriad examples in ethnic literature and joking traditions like this. Langston Hughes wrote about jokes Negroes tell on themselves. That was the title. My Jewish buddy, Jules Chometsky, offered one that illustrates the Jewish version. There was a rabbi, a priest, and a Methodist minister on a flight. It crashed, and they were marooned on a desert island. The priest pulls out his rosary, starts praying. The minister reads his Bible. He prays too. The rabbi, though, takes off his shirt and stretches out to get a tan. The other two berate him, but he replies, listen, I'm also a successful businessman. 10 years ago, I did well. I gave the United Jewish Appeal $1 million. 5 years ago, I gave $5 million. This year, it was $20 million. They'll find me. This joke builds upon the traditional stereotypes of Jews as greedy and obsessed with money, but deconstructs it with humor and the fillip that the money is used for good purposes. And moreover, it takes an indictment and makes it into an American virtue. Namely, it's good to make money in America. We also need to think about what happened after years of prejudicial treatment of Italians, Irish, Jews, Poles, Mexicans, and other groups. Television tried to flip the pattern with the rise of sitcoms, which provided an opportunity for WASP Americans to inspect their relatively new neighbors from a safe distance. Producers knew that comedy creates intimacy, so the shows like Life with Luigi, The Goldbergs, I Love Lucy, and the Irish Life with Riley brought positive images of ethnics into the nation's living rooms. Throughout her early life, O'Connor, like many haughty intellectuals today, prided herself and her mother on not having a TV. However, after she helped some nuns get a book published, they gave her a set, and she quickly became fascinated by this window into popular culture. Brad Gooch in the biography tells of her watching Vincent Sheen's religious shows, and also notes that in her later years, her friends were surprised by how much time she spent listening to records and watching television. As he puts it, TV satisfied a taste for the vulgarities of popular culture that used to be filled for her solely by newspaper coverage. Of Roy Rogers' horse, Trigger attending church in Pasadena, or a local beauty contest for Miss Georgia Chick. Now she was up on, quote, Geritol, Pepto-Bismol, Anacin, Bufferin, any kind of soap or floor wax. She loved car races and even caught a performance of W.C. Fields' 1941 hit, Never Give a Sucker an Even Break. O'Connor also sometimes used what I call in-your-face humor, and she admired other writers who did so. She approvingly told the story of a woman who came up to Faulkner once with a book by him she had bought and asked him if she would like it. He replied, I think you'll like it. It's trash. Similarly, O'Connor was once asked the tired question, Miss O'Connor, why do you write? To which she snapped, because I'm good at it. Not only that, she quoted herself saying this later rather proudly. She also deplored condescending and sometimes hypocritical sympathy, epitomized by what I call the South's bless her heart syndrome. I remember a conversation I had with an old high school classmate after a reunion. She commented, poor Candy, she looked tired. I guess I would be too after 3 husbands. I saw a picture of her children, Chance and Caprice. What can you say about a woman who names her kids after a card game and a car? Oh, well, I guess she does the best she can. Bless her heart. This last phrase is often used as a kiss-off for a critique, but it's intended to atone from the malice in an attack, and is perhaps as heartfelt in some occasions, maybe. Certainly, O'Connor is prone to mounting a comic portrait of many of her farm women, as Monica Miller has shown, but at story's end, when they've had moments of grace or revelation, we readers can also say, bless her heart, and mean it. This came up in a comic way when O'Connor was shopping in the Davidson's department store in Atlanta on crutches, and she tells us this story. An old lady fixed me with a moist, gleaming eye and said in a loud voice, bless you, darling. I felt exactly like the misfit. I gave her a weakly, lethal look, whereupon, greatly encouraged, she grabbed my arm and whispered very loud, remember what they said to John at the gate, darling. It wasn't my floor on that elevator, but I got off, and I suppose the old lady was astounded at how quick I could get away on crutches. I have a one-legged friend. I asked her what they said to John. She said, they said the lame shall enter first. And she concludes, this may be because the lame will be able to knock everybody else aside with their crutches. And of course, this is the title of one of her most famous stories. This is a fine example of so many things in O'Connor's writings. First, the ability to tell a really short story, one that has several morals in a comic wrapper. She was always fiercely resistant to pity, which she rightly saw as diminishing, and she felt the woman was condescending. But her athletic escape was also a sign of her resilience. She knew, too, that just the facts of a situation could be funny and could be even more rib-splitting with just a little embellishment. And here's a wonderful example of a short story in a paragraph. I spent the weekend with Carolyn Gordon and Sue Jenkins. They had a party. The chief guests were dear old Malcolm Cowley and dear old Van Wyck Brooks, 2 leading literary critics of the time. Dear old Van Wyck insisted that I read a story, at which horror-stricken looks appeared on the faces of both Caroline and Sue. "Read the shortest one," they both screamed. I read A Good Man is Hard to Find. Mr. Brooks later remarked to Miss Jenkins, "It was a shame someone with so much talent would look upon life as a horror story." Malcolm was very polite and asked if I had a wooden leg. Her mother, of course, was the victim of her humor as well, and sometimes of compliments, comic compliments. She had a troubled relationship with her. She was both a blessing and a cross to bear, because she did everything for Flannery after she got ill and had to live at home. She, too, was always asking her why she didn't write about normal people. And I identified with that. My own mother, we called her Bird, complained often about how writers depicted messed up people. Why don't they write about good people? I told her, "Bird, normal people are boring unless they're placed in difficult situations." And as my friend Ernest Gaines often stated, without conflict, there is no story. And of course, Tolstoy began Anna Karenina by declaring, "Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." My mother also bemoaned the fact that I wrote scholarly books. "You're such a good writer. Why don't you write novels?" To which I replied, "That's a good idea. My first book is going to be titled Psycho Bird." Many critics have written on the role Regina played in her daughter's life and fiction. Her letters are filled with comic portraits of her mom, almost without comment, since her pronouncements and actions speak for themselves. Fiercely independent, she hated the fact that she had to be so reliant on anyone, and although she loved her, she often set her up as a kind of emblem of the indifferent reader she was trying to reach. A useful anecdote to these portraits is found in the loving letters she wrote to Regina when she was a young student in the Iowa Writers Seminar, which Monica Miller has edited. Letters that more often than not are full of requests for clothing, food, condiments, books, what have you, from home. Her letters revealed that she and her mother had what theorists call a joking relationship. Mahadev Apte tells us the kin-based joking relationships are obligatory in the sense that individuals are under strong pressure to bear without anger any joking, teasings, insult, or abuse imposed on them by their joking partners, even if they're unwilling to reciprocate. In many of the vexed parent-child relationships that she features in her stories, think of Hulga, Thomas, Julian, there's a long list, there's no give and take re-joking, a sign of familial dis-ease. Here's an example of O'Connor's joking relationship with her mother. My mama and I have interesting discussions over some modern library books that I had just ordered. She, Moby Dick, I've always heard about that, 2 B's. Me, M-O-W-B-Y Dick. She, the Idiot. You would get something called The Idiot. What's it about? Me, an idiot. O'Connor's comments on her mother in the letters often make fun of her, but she often expresses admiration. You can't get that by mother, she'll say. But the stories are something else, where mothers can be either cold and uncaring, as in The River or Greenleaf, but in others it's the child who mistreats the mother, as in Good Country People, The Enduring Chill, The Comforts of Home, and most memorably, Everything That Rises Must Converge. In most of the second group, the mother is pictured as capable, sensible, and caring, although some of them are suspect because of their lack of faith or their racism. Repeatedly, O'Connor satirizes the sons, who are too full of themselves. At the same time, though, they're ineffective, lacking in the strength of their usually dead fathers, and are really cruel to their mothers, even when, as in The Comforts of Home, O'Connor tells us he loves her. A comic prop in Everything That Rises is the hideous purple hat that his mother wears. Interestingly, Eudora Welty has a short story entitled The Purple Hat, set in New Orleans, which may have influenced O'Connor. And then again, she and/or Welty may have influenced John Kennedy Toole's The Confederacy of Dunces, where Mrs. Riley, his mother, who has a hard row to hoe with her obnoxious son, has a similar hat that attracts the desire of a gay character, Dorian Green. I've written a good long thing on the affinities between those two writers. He was clearly inspired by O'Connor. We also need to think about comic form and structure. Mary Douglas has speculated on what the reactions of Freud and Bergson might be if they saw a man slip and fall on a banana peel. Freud, she suggests, would laugh because the man shifts to a swift action as if a new form of life had been hidden there. Bergson would cackle because the man lost control and became a helpless automaton. She splits the difference by suggesting that a joke is an attack on control. The basic setup of many of O'Connor's stories is exactly that. Mrs. May of Greenleaf loses control, and indeed her life, to the bull. Shepard's orderly home life in The Lame Shall Enter First is shattered by Rufus. Mrs. Cope's fear of her woods burning comes to pass when she cedes control to the three wild boys. In a theological and cosmic view, man's fall into nihilism means the loss of moral control. Mary Douglas also posits that a joke is a play upon form, and O'Connor was intensely determined to mount her comic parables in an ordering form, which would in turn contrast with the chaos she creates for her artists, her characters. And my friend Ernest Gaines frequently told me, without form, there is no art. We might remember here that the traditional pattern of comedy is order, disorder, order, restored. And restoration is often signaled by a marriage, as in Shakespeare's comedies. In terms of popular culture, I Love Lucy usually begins with a tranquil domestic scene, which erupts when Lucy comes up with a chaos-causing scheme, initiating a phone call to her companion in crime. Ethel, get up here. Order is always restored, often by her husband, Desi, and the episode more often than not ends with a marital kiss. In the O'Connor stories that end in the character's redemption, classically, in A Good Man Is Hard to Find, we have this closure, but in a different way. Other stories violate the pattern and end in uncertainty. One of the last things I want to talk about is what I call booty laughs. Some readers have taken exception to the comedy O'Connor makes from Disability, most notoriously, of course, the wooden leg of Hulga in Good Country People, but also with the one-armed Mr. Shiflett and his mutant, mentally challenged bride, Lucy Nell, or the club-footed Rufus in The Lame Shall Enter First, and in her second novel, the moot and challenged child Bishop, who is surely modeled in part on Faulkner's Benjy. Although she often disparaged the sensational novels of Erskine Caldwell, whose Tobacco Road featured the sexual hijinks of a hare lip and a woman with no nose, she featured many differently bodied people in her works too, and they're often depicted, at least by the other characters, in disdainful, mocking ways. However, it's been asserted by various critics these figures are symbolic of the fallen state of man in general, and the handicaps can lead to a state of grace, as in Good Country People. But in general, O'Connor is a great comic poet of the body. She explores it and exploits it in virtually all of her work. In this, she's following in the footsteps of medieval literature, Fabliaux and Rabelais. That writer's outrageous, fantastic, and obscene use of the body operates as his chief comedic arsenal. To gain readers' attention, he makes his characters grotesque, employing degradation in order to lower elevated material to the realm of the people, a coming down to earth that becomes positive, festive, and fertilizing. As Bakhtin in his study of Rabelais noted, this leads to an emphasis on appetites as well as on apertures, convexities, the phallus, the pot belly, the nose, breast, and the anus. Bodily excretions are part of this scenario as well. This is particularly well done by Toole in Confederacy. Over and over, O'Connor, too, uses varied types of degradation of her characters, including bodily forms, in order to clear the ground for new growth and moral salvation. She even uses it in names, as in Red Sammy Butts, and The Good Man Is Hard to Find. His, quote, khaki trousers reached just to his hip bones, and his stomach hung over them like a sack of meal swaying under his shirt. Most of her characters, even the, quote, morons, have this ability to degrade the body. Enoch Emery describes a woman who took him in. I reckon she was 40-year-old, but she sure was ugly. She had these here brown glasses. Her hair was so thin it looked like ham gravy trickling over her skull. Other times, names suggest predation. Asa Shrike's last name in The Peeler, the story, refers to a killer bird who breaks its prey's necks and skewers them with his beak. She might have snitched the name, too, from Nathaniel West's dark comedy, Miss Lonely Hearts, which she admired. In her story, The Comforts of Home, the supposed nymphomaniac's assumed name is comic, Star Drake. But so is her real name, Sarah Ham. O'Connor has an affinity for names that bring in pigs, an animal she uses to great effects in many of her tales. The part of the body she used most often, however, were the eyes. Star Drake's sexual advances terrify Thomas, the celibate, ineffective middle-aged son. He's shaken when she renames him as Tomsey and brags about creating the label. Tomsey, though, can be broken down to Tom and C. Remember that in Wise Blood, after young Hayes has attended the peep show, his mother, suspicious, asks, "What you seen?" And the novel ends with a character looking deeply into his blinded eyes. She often uses bizarre bodies, even better, dead bizarre bodies, in a kind of macabre humor that is designed to get the reader's horrified attention, as in the beginning of A Circle in the Fire, when the Raven of Doom, Mrs. Pritchard, tells Mrs. Cope about the lady who had a baby in an iron lung. Because she was kin, Mrs. Pritchard, she and her family gone to see the body. Mrs. Cope doesn't comment as, quote, "these calamitous stories wore her to a frazzle." Mrs. Pritchard would go 30 miles for the satisfaction of seeing anybody laid away. I had a friend in Baton Rouge who went to every funeral, even if she didn't know them sometimes. Mrs. Pritchard and her husband are Mrs. Cope's hard hands, and she clearly looks down on them. Mrs. Pritchard's obsession with the iron lung lady partly stems from her morbid curiosity about how she got pregnant in the first place. I wonder, too. Her tale about this dead lady is similar to the freak show Leota tells her client Mrs. Fletcher about in Weltney's wonderful comic story, Petrified Man. "Well, honey, they got these two twins in a bottle, see? Born joined plumb together. Dead, of course. See, this face looked this away, the other face looked that away, over their shoulders, see? Kind of pathetic. Well, ugly? Honey, I mean to tell you, their parents were first cousins and all that." As William Hazlitt remarked long ago, we laugh at absurdity, we laugh at deformity, we laugh at mischief, we laugh to show our satisfaction with ourselves or our contempt for those about us, or to conceal our envy or our ignorance. We laugh at fools and at those who pretend to be wise, at extreme simplicity, awkwardness, hypocrisy, and affection. And I would suggest we find all of these elements over and over again, not just in O'Connor, but also in Welty. Catherine Ann Porter was a friend and model for both Welty and O'Connor, and she praised Welty in particular for what she saw her use of just cruelty in Petrified Man, and that term seems apt for many of O'Connor's descriptions of some of her characters. One of the things missing in her comic arsenal is a system of joking relationships, although I already identified one with her mother. In Robert Harling's Steel Magnolias, Truvy's beauty parlor clients' friends enjoy teasing and permitted mild insults. Such relationships demonstrate that the participants are part of a social group, something we don't find all that often in O'Connor, perhaps because the majority of her leading figures are loners in one way or another, and they have to be alone for us to encounter their spiritual struggles. In all the examples I provided, O'Connor purposely creates comic effects because she clearly understands that authors need to gain and keep the attention of the reader, and humor constitutes one of the best hooks. However, there are always troubling and or profound issues under the humor, and we can reach those points through and sometimes because of the comic bait. As Freud, Bakhtin, Apte, and many other theorists of laughter have showed us, humor can be au fond, very serious indeed, and often offers a pathway to questions that can lead, as authors intend, to long-term reflection. In O'Connor's case, very often these questions concern faith, grace, and the comedy of redemption. Ethnic humor makes us agree with the Roman writer Terence, who said, "I am a human being, and so I believe that nothing human is foreign to me." Clearly, O'Connor felt the same way and fearlessly led readers into a full exploration of our shared conditions, spanning the comedy of everyday life and the yearning for salvation. In between, we find knaves, fools, criminals, clowns, nihilists, and all types of sinners, but also sacrificing mothers, secular saints, and myriad figures struggling between the poles of freedom. As I have indicated, I'm coming to the end, O'Connor's use of violence and humor, often at the same time, is a way to shock, instruct, and transform the reader. As she famously stated, "To the hard of hearing, you have to shout." But Kafka, a writer she admired, said it another way. "If the book we are reading does not wake us as with a fist hammering on our skull, why then do we read it? So that it shall make us happy? Good God, we'd also be happy if we had no books, and such books as make us happy we could, if need be, write ourselves. But what we must have are those books which come upon us like ill fortune and distress us deeply, like the death of one we love better than ourselves, like suicide. A book must be an ice axe to break the sea frozen inside us." It was O'Connor's perception that humor could also be this axe that led to her greatest works. Let me close by emphasizing that so much of O'Connor's wit and wisdom is relevant to our own troubled times, as I hope I've suggested. O'Connor was equally concerned about the loss of old traditions and erupting racial conflict and poor education for both blacks and whites. In a letter to Marriott Lee, she combined all this in a comic lament that was at the same time deeply serious, one that speaks to us today when books are being banned, teachers are being fired, and history is in danger of whitewashing. Quote, "It's so funny that you forget it is also terrible. 10 years ago, there was an education meeting here at which 2 Negro teachers or superintendents attended. Everything was as separate and equal as possible, even down to 2 Coca-Cola machines, white and colored. But that night, a cross was burned. And those times weren't as troubled as these. The people who burned the cross couldn't have gone past the 4th grade, but for the time, they were mighty interested in education." So we can conclude from that and from so much of her writing that not only Hayes and Tarwater were prophets, so was O'Connor. As the Bible says, Selah. Thank you.
We have time for questions. If someone will just raise your hand, I'll bring you the microphone. Someone with a question.
Well, I must have said it all.
John, do you think that we're going to lose the ability to laugh at O'Connor in our
No,
current time?
I mean, the definition of a classic is that it takes on new meanings for everybody in the ages that succeeded. And I think we'll be reading her works and understanding them in new ways, including, her humor for decades to come. I mean, she's kind of timeless.
I'm still working with this idea. You use the word degradation in comparison to some of the bodies, and a lot of what you said was resonating with me. That's not one I really have ever thought about, particularly not in relationship to some of the characters you mentioned. Can you say some more about that?
About her use of the body, treatment of the body? Well, she had a very physical view of the world and what's in it, and that included nature, but it also included people that she knew. And you can see in the cartoons that she's very attentive to shapes and arms. And I mean, Thaddeus was telling us about the tubal technique that she employed. But another thing that makes her interest in the body important is that she was very concerned with the concept of the gesture. And so many of those cartoon figures, you know, just the way they have their arms or their legs or whatever gives us a message. But she also is very attuned to the degradation of the body. I mean, she had this incurable disease during so much of her writing career, and she was very attentive to illnesses and amputations. I mean, Mr. Shiflett, and I mean, I had a long thing on Mr. Shiflett's story, which, you know, it ends with his stump hanging out of the cars, and one of the critics calls it the crooked cross. There's so many ways in which she's seeing the body as the central element of our identity, but one that's not complete without the spiritual. And so to define the spiritual, you have to go through the body. I think that's part of it.
You mentioned the bringing together of violence and humor, and I wonder if you could say a little more about that, and maybe especially in relationship to certain scenes, episodes, I don't know, that maybe I perversely laugh at, and I'm kind of curious if she thought they were funny. For example, Joy Helga losing her leg and calling out, "Give my leg, give me my leg." Well, I laugh at that. I wonder if she find that humorous? Did she?
I'm certain she did.
Okay.
In fact, she was talking about the cover that she didn't like of a collection of her short stories, and she said it would have been better if they just put a big number of wooden legs on it. So clearly she thought it was funny. But, I mean, we laugh at all kinds of things that maybe we think we shouldn't. Skip Gates has said, though, that it's okay to laugh at things that amuse us, even if we know they're not, because he loves Amos and Andy, which, you know, a lot of black people find very repellent. He thinks it's great. He grew up on it, you know. So, of course, the French say chacun son goût, you know, everybody to his own taste, and O'Connor was aware of that, I think. But she's also aware that she probably was going to offend some people. Sometimes she intended to offend them because she felt like Kafka did. She had to reach them. The combination of violence and humor is a shock. But that's, as I said, that's Freud's definition of the comic, is when you do that, when you force two opposed elements together. And it may be something you really don't think you should laugh at, but you do. And a lot of times it's the structure of the joke rather than the content anyway that becomes amusing.
So I often think, and listening to your talk and Thaddeus's talk together this week makes me just see so much more of this, the comic aspect of O'Connor's work. And I kind of see that as the theme or the music, as it were, of her writing. And I'm wondering if you can think of some times in her fiction where there's the opposite. You know, I mean, if you think about seriousness, like you have music and then you have rests, right? The silence.
Well, yeah, I can give you some examples. I mean, I reread The Lame Shall Enter First, and it was really painful. I mean, it's a really depressing story, it seems to me. She wrote a number of stories that makes fun of do-gooders, and of course the central character in it, Shepard, ignores his own son to deal with this juvenile delinquent that he's taken in. And there's another story, you know, it's The Comforts of Home, I think, isn't it, where Star Drake is taken in. She's a nymphomaniac, I referred to that. And that has more humor in it, but The Lame Shall Enter First doesn't have much at all. And I don't see much in the last novel either. And both of them have power, and I'm not dismissing that, but I miss the humor, in both of those stories. I think some of her later stories are guilty of this. However, she made up for it in Revelation, which I think is one of the great masterpieces, and it was late. And there's a lot of humor in that, in addition to the very serious themes of redemption and transcendence.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate this topic. I'm coming at my studies as a high school teacher, so I'm trying to find ways to bring O'Connor into the contemporary classroom for younger readers. And a big focus for me in my classroom is how to develop the wit and humor of the students, because they are naturally funny and provoked by humor. But generally, their humor, I find, is influenced by sitcom or Nickelodeon-type sarcastic humor, and
Right.
I try to coach them on exactly what you're talking about, of using form and not just going to this other kind of humor that can be more shallow and offensive. But I was really struck by your wording of the double-edged sword of humor. And so I'm just wondering if you can speak to that, about using O'Connor and not have, I don't want to fall into this conversation, at least right now, about, we're not going to be able to laugh with students or read these stories and laugh, because I don't see that as the case. I think students are naturally looking for that unifying humor, but I am concerned that the way that they approach humor needs to be molded. And so I think I'm concerned about how to bring them to O'Connor and develop that sense of humor.
Well, I think one of the ways you can do it is pair O'Connor with other writers. Like, for instance, you could do some of her stories that feature freaks of various kinds with Petrified Man, where the ladies in the beauty parlor, they go on and on about the freak show, by the way. That's what I read, is just part of it. And when you laugh your head off at it, you think, what am I doing? Am I a sick person? I mean, she's talking about dead Siamese twins and these pygmies that are little tiny. Your husband could be one of those. Think about that, things like that. And the humor of the bizarre and the strange is something that always attracts children, I think. The idea of I'm sorry I didn't get to do the long thing I wrote about the humor of animals in her work, because that would be appealing to children as well. Because, of course, our greatest cartoonist started out with a mouse. In fact, I heard a joke about DeSantis being defeated by a mouse that didn't wear pants, which I thought was funny. But there are a lot of comic stories that you could put next to her and talk about humor across the tradition of Southern literature and American literature. Another thing that would work, I think that I had another long reading of The Life You Save May Be Your Own, which is a masterpiece. And Mr. Shiflett is a great example of a trickster. And if you're doing Huckleberry Finn, I mean, he can be compared very easily to the King and the Duke, who are, perhaps the supreme examples of the trickster figure in Southern literature, and they've been copied so many times by various other people. So they like stories about people being fooled, I think. Maybe they're thinking of fooling their parents. I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question, but...
So we have Monica Miller watching online. She wants to, she said she's interested in your characterization of O'Connor's use of comic compliments, resonating from the reference to Steel Magnolias. She was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about O'Connor's use of comic compliments in her work.
Oh, that's a hard one. I can illustrate it from Steel Magnolias, though, because Truvy doesn't like her son. I think it's the son named Spud, which is another funny name. She says, the nicest thing I can say about that girl? all her tattoos are spelled correctly. And that's the kind of, I can't pull out of my head the passages like that. There are passages like that in O'Connor, for sure. But you know, the title of the book of her essays is Mystery and Manners, and she was very attuned to manners and the way those kinds of fake compliments are, you know, part and parcel of the code of manners. Sometimes you can tweak the code and take advantage of it and make it into a barb when it's supposed to be a compliment. But that's another great subject. What does she really think of manners in Southern society? I mean, she admires them in many ways, but she knows that a lot of them are deplorable and have, you know, bad origins and so forth. So I think that would be a great project for somebody in this group.
Someone else.
We're done, huh?
We're about at the end of our time anyway, so
Okay.
we really thank you so much.
Thank you for
being here tonight.
coming.